Hello. I'm Mr. Ed.
A horse is a horse, of course, and no one can talk to a horse, of course. That is, of course, unless the horse is the famous Mr. Ed. Go right to the source and ask the horse. He'll give you the answer that you endorse. He's always on a steady course. Talk to Mr. Ed.
This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon, adding green to your life. In the summer of 1986, Nickelodeon committed 90 minutes of its daytime programming for a little block called Nickelodeon Summer Camp, which aired 3 of the channel's Nick at Night offerings, possibly as a way to entice the stay-at-home parents looking after their kids on summer break to try out their after-bedtime programming. The 3 shows aired were, in this order, The Donna Reed Show, My 3 Sons, and Mr. Ed. And from that selection, it's clear right away that Mr. Ed is the odd duck here. Both The Donna Reed Show and My 3 Sons were family sitcoms starring big-name Hollywood actors making the transition to television. And neither really had a hook for the young, modern Nickelodeon viewer. The Donna Reed Show was pretty dang dull, while My 3 Sons was much more inventive and funny. But none of that matters if you can't turn the heads of Gen Xers and the youngest millennials. Mr. Ed was not a family life sitcom. In fact, there isn't a single child character in sight, and it didn't have the big Hollywood names in the cast. But Mr. Ed very clearly has a hook. It's a show about a talking horse. Bam! You now have the attention of the 7-year-olds in the audience.
The Pride is back on Nick at Night.
This is America, where every horse has the same opportunity to reach the top, regardless of race, breed, or color.
Mr. Ed, weeknights at 8:30, 7:30 Central.
Mr. Ed is a screwball sitcom that originally aired for 143 episodes over 6 seasons, between 1961 and 1966. This is the story of newlyweds Wilbur and Carol Post, played by Alan Young and Connie Hines. Wilbur is an architect, Carol is a housewife, and they've just purchased a nice new house in the San Fernando Valley. With the house comes a small barn, and unbeknownst to the Posts, with the barn comes a horse, a handsome palomino of unknown origins. Wilbur quickly falls in love with the animal, and the couple decide to keep him. But once Wilbur and the horse are alone together, something magical happens.
When I was a little boy, I wanted a pony. Of course, it's been a long time since I was a little boy.
It's been a long time since I was a pony.
It's impossible. I don't believe it. Now, while I'm looking right at you, say something.
Like what?
Anything.
Cow now. Brown cow.
The horse goes by the name Mr. Ed, and he'll only speak to Wilbur for reasons that aren't very clear. This is a problem, because Wilbur doesn't want to come off as mentally troubled to his wife, and especially not to his nosy and judgmental neighbors Roger and Kay Addison, played by Larry Keating and Edna Skinner. But if he was just keeping his conversations with Ed a secret, that would be one thing. Ed has other plans. For a horse, he's very needy, very egotistical, and is prone to acts of selfishness and jealousy. And he wants to do things that humans do. He wants to go to parties. He wants to adopt a kid of his own. He wants to get the latest in hi-fi technology. Ed will often scheme and go off on his own to get what he wants, oftentimes getting Wilbur in trouble, forcing Wilbur to wrangle in Mr. Ed, fix the damage he's caused, and somehow not come across as an insane person.
Mr. Post, what are you smiling at?
Oh, well, my mother always taught us kids to smile. You see, she felt that a smile opens all doors. Mother always... What? What?
It's obviously a much more cartoony concept than any of the other retro baby boomer TV shows Nickelodeon had aired up to this point. Lots of prop comedy, with Mr. Ed walking around in oversized costumes, usually leading to absurd visuals made for one of those with no context Twitter accounts.
Ed, you'll kill yourself. Get off that skateboard.
Woo! Ed, look out!
There's a great deal of slapstick, too. Alan Young is usually up for it, but some of these pratfalls are so extreme, they have to bring in a not-so-subtle stunt actor. There was also a number of episodes dedicated to celebrity guest appearances, in a very Simpson-esque fashion, with real-world actors or sports stars either moving into the same neighborhood or them hiring Wilbur to design a building for them. An example of the former would be a new neighbor coming in and playing their music loud in the middle of the night, so when Wilbur and company go over to tell them to turn it down, uh-oh, it's glamour star Zsa Zsa Gabor.
Zsa Zsa Gabor? What a surprise. So you're our new neighbor.
Only temporarily. I took this place for a month or two.
I got it. I got it, Josh. Hi, Carol. Carol?
Billy, darling, are you hurt?
No, I'm all right. Zsa.
Try noisy neighbor.
As for the latter, how about another classic Hollywood sex symbol with Mae West showing up at the Post's front door and commissioning Wilbur to build her a barn. Now, Mae West's whole thing is that every single thing she says, every single thing, is flirty. And when your show's main character is Mr. Ed, well, I mean...
Scrub him down good, boys. I don't want him to smell like a horse. Make him look sleek and chic.
I don't think he likes his bubble bath. He's been bathing us more than we've been bathing him.
He's just a playful baby. Aren't you tall, blonde, and bushy-tailed?
Television cowboy era Clint Eastwood, Lassie star John Provost, the Los Angeles Dodgers, Abigail Van Buren, Dear Abby, a wide variety of stars from a wide variety of entertainment industries. And if Mr. Ed doesn't already feel like a living cartoon, an actual cartoon alien showed up one time.
And I expect perfect dignity and decorum from everyone.
Moko, why did you make that Earthling put that silver bowl on his head?
Oh, I was just testing my powers to see if I could control his mind.
This is Moko, a little animated sprite from space that can possess people and get into all kinds of trouble. Man, this party is stuffy and boring. I, a ghost from Mars, really need to liven things up.
Vern, as I just said, you are leaving. You're leaving Pops and you're dancing with me.
The season 4 episode where Moko appears was actually a backdoor pilot for a Moko the Martian TV show that never got off the ground. But it says a lot about Mr. Ed that this episode doesn't feel all that out of place. So it's very clear that comparing Mr. Ed with shows like Donna Reed and My Three Sons is very apples and oranges. Those two shows belong to the trends of 50s television, when the medium was new and unproven and shows that were simple and easy to produce were preferable. Mr. Ed is 60s television. Now that TV had become an institution across the country, the three networks could experiment more with weirder, high-concept comedies. Mr. Ed was an early part of a wave that included shows like The Beverly Hillbillies, Gilligan's Island, The Addams Family, The Munsters, Bewitched, I Dream of Genie, and so on. And let's not forget the rise of primetime animation with shows like The Flintstones and The Jetsons. Mr. Ed is a bit of a trailblazer, as it predates all of those shows, except The Flintstones. However, what's new for TV is old for Hollywood, and the origins of Mr. Ed take us back 15 years prior, with David Stern's 1946 novel, Francis. This is the story of Peter Sterling, a young soldier fighting on the front lines of Japan in World War II, whose life is saved by a talking army mule named Francis. "I don't believe it," I said. "I flatly refuse to believe it." "Believe what?" "That a mule can talk," I said. "I'm not particularly interested in whether you believe it or not," said the mule. "Probably we'll both have our blocks knocked off before we get back, so what's the difference?" But it's fantastic," I stammered. "After all, you can talk," said the animal. "I'm a second lieutenant," I said. "And I'm just as impressed as you are," said the mule, having had some previous experience with second lieutenants. David Stern had been a captain in the United States Army, and his book was very much concerned with military humor, in-jokes for service members now settling down after the war. The novel was successful enough that a sequel, Francis Goes to Washington, was published in 1948, and soon after, the film rights for Francis were purchased by film director Arthur Lubin. Lubin had made a name for himself in the 1940s, directing the first 5 Abbott and Costello films, as well as the Claude Rains version of The Phantom of the Opera. But he wasn't that into the serious projects. He was much more interested in comedies and fantastical works, and Francis was right up his alley. As a movie fan myself, I am tired of watching neurotic material on the screen. I can easily skip the latest psychiatric spellbinders, but I've seen Miracle on 34th Street a half dozen times. Lubin shopped the Francis project around for a bit, and Francis was ultimately picked up by Universal International. Donald O'Connor was cast as Peter Sterling, and Chill Wills was cast as the voice of Francis, with the mule being trained by Lester Hilton, who was also responsible for coming up with the methods to make it seem like the mule was talking. More on that later. Keeping with the book's connections to the Army, the film was first shown to Army troops stationed in Germany in January of 1950. Francis made its premiere to the general public on February 8, 1950, and it was a solid success, becoming the 11th highest grossing film of that year.
Shh, they're right up there. What do we do now? I'm gonna get behind them. You stay here. When I yell, fire a couple of shots in the air.
In the air?
Shh, quiet.
Universal International saw strong possibilities with turning Francis into a film franchise, so they purchased the rights from Lubin and got to work releasing annual sequels. Between 1950 and 1956, the studio released 7 Francis films, the first 6 of which were directed by Lubin. Fun fact, Francis film number 6, 1955's Francis in the Navy, was Clint Eastwood's first credited film appearance. His guest appearance on Mr. Ed was him basically paying back the favor. Francis himself became a pretty major animal star for the time, even showing up as a guest on the game show What's My Line? For Arthur Lubin, Francis was his project. However, due to a mix of contract disputes and people moving on to other things, Lubin, along with Donald O'Connor and Chill Wills, were all absent for the 7th and final film, Francis in the Haunted House, which didn't do great critically and effectively ended the Francis franchise. Now, Lubin was also an early believer in television, and as early as 1952, he was trying to get a Francis TV show off the ground. Alas, if he wanted to do that, he probably shouldn't have sold the franchise rights, and he couldn't get them away from Universal International, even after the studio decided to stop making Francis movies. Well, that sucks, but Lubin was determined. If we can't make a Francis TV show, we'll make a bootleg Francis TV show. As long as we have a comedy about a talking barnyard animal and his put-upon owner, then we're golden. Easier said than done. Arthur Lubin was a respected craftsman in the film industry, but he wasn't exactly a marquee name. Lubin needed 2 things. He needed a pre-existing talking animal franchise, even the smallest bit of name brand recognition would help, and he needed a partner in crime who could sell the show on his behalf. For the former, Lubin turned to the world of magazine short stories, which once upon a time people actually read. And now we jump back even further to 1937 for Mr. Ed's second origin point, the short stories of Walter R. Brooks. Also known as the man behind the children's book series Freddie the Pig, New York native Walter Brooks wrote the first Ed story, The Talking Horse, for Liberty magazine to be published on September 18, 1937. This is the story of Wilbur Pope, an advertising executive, and his hot-tempered Spanish wife Carlotta, who buy a horse named Ed for their home in Mount Kisco, New York. Out on assignment, Wilbur learns about a magical plant that will let you understand the language of animals. But it turns out you don't need magic plants if you just annoy the animal enough. Well, by and by, they came out of the hilltop and Mr. Pope started to sing. Ed looked around at him a couple of times, but Mr. Pope just smiled and patted his neck and said, "You're a good scout, Ed, and if you die, I promise I'll have you stuffed and stuck up whole over the mantelpiece, whatever Carlotta says." And he went on singing. And then Ed turned around again and said, "Oh, for Pete's sake, Wilb, shut up." By the way, I'm not forgetting to put punctuations and quotation marks in. This story is formatted like a nightmare. I can't speak to just how popular this story was, but I guess it was popular enough for another Ed story, and another, and another. Between 1937 and 1945, 23 Ed and Wilbur Pope stories were published across 4 publications, including Esquire, Argosy, and the Saturday Evening Post. They were usually about an oft-drunk Wilbur Pope bouncing off of upper-class society and having Ed help him get out of social engagements. No horses on skateboards or getting possessed by Martians here. The original Ed stories are pretty dry. Walter Brooks passed away in 1958 and hadn't written an Ed and Wilbur story in nearly 15 years. But the premise was close enough to what Arthur Lubin wanted to accomplish with his show. And again, any name brand recognition is a good thing in this industry. Next, there was the matter of getting a big name attached to the project. A household name. Someone who had conquered theater, radio, film, and television. Enter George Burns.
I have a horse that talks.
Shame you're such a young fella. Sit down.
At the time, Burns was best known as the straight man in a double act with his wife, Gracie Allen. An act that went from vaudeville to radio and finally to the George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, premiering in 1950 and running until 1958, when Gracie Allen decided to retire from the show business. Burns, with his ever-present cigar, tried to go on as a solo act for a while, but ultimately took a step back behind the cameras to produce. And one of the first projects he got behind was Arthur Lubin and his obsession with talking barnyard animals.
How do you do? I'm George Burns. You can tell by my cigar. At my age, I've got to hold on to something. Well, I'm here to talk to you about that picture you just saw. Isn't that talking horse a wonderful idea? I think the possibilities of that idea can go through the roof. I think this can be the #1 television show.
With George Burns supervising the show's development and talking to the networks, Lubin got to work producing a pilot, made by the production company Filmways and filmed in Burns' personal studio in Hollywood. The pilot was under the working title of Wilbur Pope and Mr. Ed, with Scott McKay and Sandra White playing Wilbur and Carlotta.
I guess it's because when I was a little boy, I always wanted a pony. Oh, it's been a long time since I was a little boy.
It's been a long time since I was a pony.
It's impossible. I don't believe it. Now, while I am looking right at you, will you let me hear you say something?
Say what?
Anything.
How now, brown cow.
While sharing a lot of elements with the final product, including most of the same gags as the show's first proper episode, the cast really wasn't clicking. Even the horse didn't seem quite right. Lubin and Burns failed to sell the show to the networks off of the pilot, which meant that if they wanted to see this show made, they'd have to make it work in syndication. And for that, they were going to need a sponsor. And for that, they'd need to rebuild things from the ground up. To get some fresh perspective, Burns brought in his producer buddy, Al Simon, who had not only worked on the Burns and Allen show, but was the associate producer for I Love Lucy. You know, the most important television show of all time. Al was enthusiastic about the idea, but he felt changes were necessary. To begin with, the original horse used in the pilot was a pathetic-looking nag. If the public were going to be attracted to Ed, he should be a fine-looking animal. Also, the story didn't revolve around Ed. It followed the actions of a large, cumbersome cast of characters, none of which were particularly appealing. Everything was recast, with an aim towards screen presence over name recognition. Alan Young wasn't an unknown actor. In fact, he had headlined a radio comedy show in the 40s that turned into a short-lived television show in the 50s, for which he won a couple of Emmys. But after a series of films with weak box office and middling reviews, Young's star was fading pretty fast come 1960. He had actually turned down the role at first, prior to the pilot, but was finally talked into it by George Burns. As for Mr. Ed himself, a new horse with the name Bamboo Harvester was brought in, along with Lester Hilton, the animal trainer from Francis, with his trademark make animals look like they're talking technique. Urban legend states that they put peanut butter under the horse's top lip, but this is entirely false, a lie created by Alan Young to keep the show's mysteries intact. And it's pretty clear from actually watching Mr. Ed that this would have been a very insufficient way of doing it, because Ed's lip movements require precise timing for a back and forth conversation.
Oh, Ed. Oh, I really missed you, old boy.
Yeah, then why didn't you write? Telegram, postcard.
Well, to tell you the truth, Ed, I got sort of involved.
Phone call, then.
It was a long distance.
So what? I would have been glad to accept the charges.
The actual method involved a wire rigging hidden in his bridle, with the wire extending under the lip and being moved off screen. By all reports, they didn't hurt the horse, but annoyed it enough to get its lips flapping. The voice of Mr. Ed was never credited on the show. Instead, Mr. Ed is credited as himself. Part of that was to make the show more whimsical, and part of that was to respect the wishes of the voice actor. Mr. Ed was voiced by veteran Western actor Alan Rocky Lane, who was already in his 50s and was living with Lester Hilton, having fallen on hard times. At this particular stage late in his career, like many other actors, he had fallen on lean times, and his buddy Lester was letting him sleep on his couch. Al Simon lost no time in cutting a deal with Rocky. At first, Rocky was dubious. He may have lost money, but he still had his pride. What would his friends think when they learned that he had been reduced to doing the voice of a horse? But the cash sounded okay, and he finally agreed to do it, if Al and Arthur Lubin promised not to reveal his name in the credits. They agreed to protect his identity and his pride. Show details were refined. Wilbur Pope became Wilbur Post, mainly to avoid the obvious Catholic jokes, and Carlotta became the far less exotic Carol, played by fresh-faced Connie Hines as a more traditional and less Spanish housewife. Wilbur went through a number of career changes, from the original ad exec to being a lawyer, before the writers settled on architect. There was still a lot of Francis in Mr. Ed's DNA. The plots were more in line with those screwball comedies than the sarcastic, drunk escapades of Brooks' Ed stories. Wilbur is also given a background as a serviceman during World War II, which really came into play in later seasons. Larry Keating, who was playing Wilbur's antagonistic neighbor Roger, died suddenly after a battle with leukemia just as they were beginning to shoot season 4. New neighbor characters were introduced, Gordon and Winnie Kirkwood, played by Leon Ames and Florence McMichael. Gordon was Wilbur's former commanding officer, and that relationship was played up for laughs.
Well, anyway, the Air Force thought my husband was smarter. That's why they made Wilbur a lieutenant and the colonel a colonel.
I don't want to say that Gordon's career was helped, but I understand your father was a general.
So what? My husband came up through the ranks.
From private to colonel in 3 months?
It was 4 months.
But rewinding a bit, Mr. Ed still needed a sponsor. The production looked towards the automobile industry, specifically Studebaker. The company was in a bit of a decline at the time and was looking for a way to improve their image and a way to promote their new line of cars, specifically the compact Lark and the sports car Avanti. So a deal was made. The characters in Mr. Ed would drive Studebaker cars. The very first shot of the very first episode would be Wilbur and Carol parking their Studebaker in front of the house. And Wilbur and Mr. Ed would become spokesman and spokeshorse for the brand.
pick up a free copy at your Studebaker dealer's showroom. Then be sure you do one more thing.
Drive the 61 Lark.
You have to drive the Lark to believe it.
In return, along with normal funding, Studebaker pledged $50 for every car sold during Mr. Ed's run. So, with a sponsor, a fresh new cast, and a refined premise, production for Mr. Ed went forward, and they began to sell it in syndication for a January 1961 premiere. And it sold really well, reaching over 100 local networks, who opted to put the show on similar time slots, which made it reliable television across the country, which meant that this first season got some pretty good ratings. You could not have asked for a better start to your TV show. Except for the whole, being attached to Studebaker thing. Studebaker went from a bit of a decline to a massive decline. Sales of the Lark plummeted after the big three manufacturers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, released their own compacts. The Avanti was still a few years away and would ultimately prove unsuccessful, and then there was a labor strike in 1962. Studebaker would close their main plant in South Bend in 1963, and close down entirely in 1967. They could not afford to keep sponsoring Mr. Ed, and the show was set adrift. Thankfully, CBS had seen how well it did and picked it up as part of their network programming. And it continued to do well in ratings for 5 more seasons, and was apt to keep going. But instead would be one of the first victims of the rural purge. As the 60s crept on, advertisers and networks began to focus more on demographics than raw rating numbers in terms of what ads were sold. CBS had a particular focus on sitcoms with a rural flavor. Shows like The Andy Griffith Show, The Beverly Hillbillies, Green Acres, Petticoat Junction, and Lassie. And these shows typically did really good ratings. But it was discovered that these ratings were coming from older viewers with less frivolous spending habits. Young people weren't watching these shows as much, so it was time to change tactics. Mr. Ed was one of the first shows pruned out, which is funny because it's easily the least rural of all of them. Yes, there's a horse and plenty of scenes of horseback riding, but it's a show taking place in Los Angeles about an upper middle class couple who are neighbors with Zsa Zsa Gabor. As Pat Buttram of Green Acres put it, CBS was canceling any show with a tree in it. The rural purge went on for another handful of years, with these shows being replaced with more modern, politically conscious comedies like The Mary Tyler Moore Show, The Bob Newhart Show, All in the Family, The Jeffersons, Maude, and MASH. Mr. Ed was way too hip for the 50s, and just way too square for the 70s. And that's the story of Mr. Ed. Which brings us to the other part of these videos, my subjective feelings about the show. I don't normally announce it like this, I usually approach it more organically, but if you're new here and are looking just for an objective documentary on the history of Mr. Ed, this is where that ends, and where stuff you might disagree with begins. I know most of you can handle that just fine, but some of you don't. It's up to you if you want to keep watching. Okay, we all good? Cool. Because I fucking hate Mr. Ed. I hate this show so much. In fact, this is probably the most I've ever hated a show on Knacks. It's certainly not the worst in terms of production quality. It looks fine and the cast is really good. I have no complaints there. And it's certainly not boring, I'll give it that. But it's such a spiteful little cockroach of a program when it has no reason to be. We've already talked about the show's cartoony elements, the oversized props for Mr. Ed, his wacky adventures. One time Mr. Ed nearly got launched into space. That's fun, right? But that's actually not the main source of comedy for this show. Instead, Mr. Ed leans into having all of its characters being incredibly cynical, hateful assholes who despise each other and make each other miserable. Ed actively makes Wilbur's life worse. Wilbur responds in the worst way possible, everyone treats him like a crazy person, and nobody ever makes up or really apologizes. Let's take a look at some of the common jokes you might find on Mr. Ed. God, I hate my wife.
You all want to go to Palm Springs? Palm Springs it is. all, I can pick up the ball games on the radio, which is not nearly as nice as picking them up in person, but if my wife willfully and selfishly places her own interests above those of her husband's, then all I can say is that her place is by her husband's side, and his side will be inside the Dodger Stadium tomorrow night.
Start packing.
I'll get that.
Marital strife is all over Mr. Ed. Oh, did you think you were watching a funny live-action cartoon about a talking horse? Surprise, it's the Honeymooners. Carol is often cross for reasons both justified and petty, and will give Wilbur the cold shoulder, and he'll stammer and fuss about it, and then go talk to Ed or his neighbors about he just doesn't understand women, and you're just waiting for someone to bring in the divorce papers. And the posts are the nice version of this. At least sometimes they'll cuddle. The neighbor characters are always one step away from domestic abuse.
Be careful, doll. If you want Mommy, just blow that mating call.
Hi, kids. Gordon, want to change your mind about playing golf? It's a beautiful day.
This sadly wasn't an uncommon trope for this era of television, but usually it would be the focus of the plot and the characters would resolve things. Because we have to devote a certain amount of time to the talking horse shenanigans, a lot of episodes end with Wilbur and Carol still mad at each other when credits roll. And what might they be fighting about? Women be shopping, am I right?
Just a minute, doll. Hold this. It's Mother's turn. There you are. Thank you, doll.
Roger, just returning your shears.
I won't need them now. I've already been clipped.
The main source of tension in this relationship is Carol or Kay or Winnie wanting to buy something expensive, and they need their husbands to agree to it because men are supposed to control the money because it's the 1960s. And when the corresponding husband doesn't agree to it, that sets the wife off.
Hello?
Wilbur, your wife is trying to squander our money again.
What do you mean? Oh.
This isn't the kind of show where the husband is a complete doofus and the wife is the intelligent one. Wilbur isn't Homer Simpson or what's his name from King of Queens. Everybody is an unreasonable jackass about everything, especially when it comes to the subject of Wilbur's mental health. Anything can be crazy if you squint enough.
You bank to the left. Now we bank to the right. Going to a spin. Fly upside down. And then I come straight out of it and head right for you. You see? Hi.
Wilbur's neighbors have no respect for his privacy and are constantly walking into his home or his office without knocking, which usually means they see Wilbur doing something without full context, and they often walk away thinking the worst of Wilbur, often that he has a mental illness. And that's an issue all its own, but these people will flip their lids when they see Wilbur do the most innocuous things. Like, one time, everyone freaked out because Wilbur was, get this, flying a kite.
What kind of a nut did you recommend? That man's crazy.
Crazy? Well, what?
I was driving by the park, and there's my future head architect, and what do you suppose he's doing?
What?
Flying a kite.
Flying a kite?
Oh, Wilbur wouldn't be flying a kite.
Well, of course not. They've already invented electricity.
Oh, you must be mistaken. Flying a kite in a park? Oh, no, you're wrong.
Crazy, mixed-up people.
A man flying a kite? He clearly belongs in a mental institution. And the thing is, the show agrees because there's actually a long, convoluted reason Wilbur is flying a kite that involves Mr. Ed. He can't just be, enjoying himself flying a kite. Let grown men fly kites, damn it. And if you think the show's petty and judgmental about Wilbur's behavior, wait till you see how the show feels about everyone else. LOL, fat people.
That was a wonderful table you set, Kay. The food is delicious.
Oh, thanks so much. Did you try the salad?
Marvelous. You know, I wasn't going to vote today, but I couldn't resist the menu.
You know, if the voters keep pouring in at this rate, we should beat last year's mark by plenty.
I think we already have, Kay. Any voters from now on are pure gravy.
Gravy. That makes me hungry again.
Hey, did you know people who are overweight love to eat? They just can't stop eating. And when they're not eating, all they're thinking about is food. Point and laugh at the fat people.
You know, Ed, you were no help at all in getting me that Banning deal. And it embarrassed me that he had to go out and rent another horse to ride the last few days he was here.
But you ought to see the horse Tubby rode. The poor thing'll never be the same.
Oh, stop, Ed.
I brought him over. See for yourself.
Oh, did you think being this grossly judgmental of women was just reserved for the human characters? Mr. Ed's gonna get in the action too. There's this one episode where he has a crush on a filly at a nearby stable, and then he visits her before she's been groomed for the day, and holy shit!
Who's that? Must be Sabrina's mother. Or grandmother.
No, that's Sabrina. See, women just don't look their best in the mornings.
She looks so old. She's 18 if she's a day.
No, she's not that old.
No? Well, I'll bet there's a set of teeth in that bucket of water.
Stop talking like that.
Come to think of it, she only chews soft oats.
Like I said, we just caught her at a bad time. You know, I think I better leave Andy a $50 deposit.
Hold it. You're not sticking me with that beast.
And this is seen as a good thing. Oh, wow, Mr. Ed really dodged a bullet. Hey boys, remember to check what your girlfriend looks like without her makeup. Make sure you're not secretly dating an ugly person. Hey, while we're here, let's laugh at the homeless too. They're just whimsical hobos with no sense of decorum. Let's laugh at young people who are a bunch of loud, foppish idiots. Hey, do you want to see Alan Young in Redface? Of course you do.
I have answer. Thanks Day, very good. Giving Day, very good. Put them both together and call holiday Appreciation Day.
It's a weird thing to say, but Mr. Ed has an almost South Park attitude towards making fun of everyone they can. Everybody's awful and everybody hates everybody else. Now, nothing here is new to television. You can find combinations of these elements in a lot of shows. What makes it worse here is that this cynical take on humanity is in a show about a talking horse who plays pool. You have this nicer, goofier source of comedy that they could draw from, but 4 times out of 5, they'll opt for gross, cynical meanness. It's like if you sat down to watch Clifford the Big Red Dog, but surprise, it's actually married with children. You know, I'm glad Alan Young found a second life in animation and became the iconic voice of Scrooge McDuck. He's too good of a performer to just be remembered for Mr. Ed. I couldn't really find a natural place in the script to mention that fact, but if I didn't bring it up, my comment section would be flooded with, "I can't believe you didn't mention that Alan Young was the voice of Scrooge McDuck." Well, I mentioned it. You can stop typing. It is this YouTuber's opinion that Mr. Ed is the worst of the 3 Nickelodeon Summer Camp shows because it has a hook that can draw in kids. The Donna Reed show has some incredibly out-of-date views of the world, but most kids aren't actually going to absorb it because it's so dull. And those who do stick with it will at least walk away with some positive messages. Mr. Ed gets you with these wacky animal antics and then tells you that girls suck and that you should point and laugh at fat people. We've been discussing Nickelodeon Summer Camp in the context of parents who might be watching the channel with their kids during the summer break months. Its purpose to draw views to the Nick at Night hours. And yeah, that makes a certain amount of business sense. But what about from the child's point of view? There are kids who vibed with retro television back then, there's no question about that. But there were also kids who might not have anything to do on a lazy Tuesday in July, who's flipping through the channels and nothing is on. Oh, but there's always something for kids airing on Nickelodeon. Maybe you can catch Danger Mouse, or you can't do that on television, or Nick Rocks. And so you switch over and it's the Donna Reed Show. It's My Three Sons. It's Mr. Ed. It's the same reruns you can find on your local UHF stations. Nickelodeon was supposed to be a place for kids, right? Every day of the week, from breakfast to bedtime, for kids by kids. And here you are, and when you need it the most, it's something for mom and dad. Maybe it's just me, but Nickelodeon Summer Camp kind of felt like the channel breaking a promise.
Nick, 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 Nick. Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nick. Nickelodeon.
Next time. Oh, you thought just because we were done with Nickelodeon Summer Camp, we were done with retro baby boomer television? Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Today's research shout-out goes to Mr. Ed and Me by Alan Young and Bill Burt. Alan Young's autobiography, with 2/3 of the book devoted to his time on Mr. Ed. Mr. Ed is one of those shows that's a lot more fun to research than it is to watch. And if you're interested in mid-20th century show business, this is a fine book for your collection. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, perhaps consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to production values, research materials, and the last loaf of bread in the grocery store. You can also support Knacks by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing to the channel, hitting that bell icon for notifications, following me on Twitter, sending a one-time donation through Ko-fi or PayPal, and sharing Knacks with all your friends. I'll see you next time.